Nobody finds you in medtech exits. You have to engineer a way to get found, and that involves crafting the right narrative. More importantly, leveraging all these different opportunities. Founders who have done it really the best spend years building that outcome. Showing that you don't need to sell is actually your best negotiator. 85% of biotech deals involve only one buyer. No competitive tension. You're not negotiating. You're literally just accepting. You have no leverage. Most medtech startups design their clinical trials to essentially satisfy the FDA. Design with the full commercial and acquisition outcome in mind, really before they even sat across a deal table. All had something in common, which was a credible alternative to selling.
You can't replace part of the brain. Like,
you treat them the same.
Source of truth for the medtech industry.
Coexists with the puppets.
Robot understands things automatically.
Number one show in the medtech industry.
So Stryker got ahead of that and changed in the 90s, billion dollar company that held up high. A lot of things.
The state of medtech with your host, Omar Khateeb.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the show. We're going to cover a really interesting topic today, which is how do you exit your company in medtech? And more importantly, this is coming from 7 lessons from about $17 billion worth of interviews. For those who are new to the channel, my name is Omar Khateeb. I'm the CEO of Marketcraft.ai. We essentially work with medtech companies and early stage companies to help them engineer and craft their market from the moment that they launch all the way through exit. So you're interested to learn more on how to get the most out of your marketing and market development efforts, go to marketcraft.ai. Now let's get into it. Let's start with the first thing, which is nobody finds you in medtech exits, okay? You have to engineer a way to get found, and that involves crafting the right narrative and, more importantly, leveraging all these different opportunities. The founders who have done it and have done it really the best spend years building that outcome really before they even sat across a deal table. And so for me, I've hosted over 350 of these episodes on the state of medtech, talking to founders, startup CEOs, investors, etc. And I've spoken more specifically to founders who have built and exited companies for hundreds of millions of dollars and billions of dollars. And when I go back through those conversations, and we went ahead and did this big shout out to Frederick on our team for helping us pull together this data and this information, the same patterns kind of show up again and again and again, which is what made me say, like, we should do an episode on this. The market really celebrates the exit number, but nobody really talks about the most important part, which is 18 to 24 months of deliberate work that produced it. And many times it goes beyond 24 months, in my opinion. So these are 7 lessons from 6 different CEOs and founders who have navigated it. And the exits, as I mentioned, total over $17 billion combined. So we have Ray Cohen at Axonics. He did an exit of $3.7 billion to Boston Scientific. But for those of you who know Ray and follow the show, you know that Ray has technically done, in the last 3 years, 3 different deals that amounted to over $5 billion of exit value. Mark McKenna, who's the CEO over at Prometheus Biosciences, which is a biotech company, they exited for about $10.8 billion to Merck, which was the largest biotech deal of 2023. We're pulling also from Dan Rose at Limflow, who exited for $250 million to Inari, Kevin Rocco at BioRez, who exited $250 million to ConMed, and finally Greg Lucier, who built and exited Nuvasive and Life Technologies. We learned a lot from there. And of course, finally, sort of an interesting one was Dr. Gregory Hansen. He built a physician-founded startup through acquisition, okay? And so you can go back through our channel. If you just search the word exits on Spotify, YouTube, etc., you can find these individual episodes, but these are the sort of the 7 lessons from all of them. So lesson number 1, acquire relationships take years, not weeks, okay? So here's the thing. Every founder who gets a premium exit said the same thing in different ways, that the conversations that mattered weren't the deal conversations. They were the ones that happened 2, 3, 4 years earlier. So look at Dan Rose. Dan Rose built Limflow into a $250 million acquisition by Inari. And when I asked him how that deal came together, he was very clear about what actually got them there. He said, quote, "It takes years. I think it's very rare for someone in medtech to wake up and say, that was a great pitch, let's buy them. In my experience, you spend years cultivating relationships with strategics. You really have to work hard to touch many points." That comes from his episode. You can look it up, episode number 164. We look at Ray Cohen's story. Ray's story was that Axonics was essentially running the same pattern. Boston Scientific didn't discover Axonics in 2022. Their familiarity with the company had been built over years through conference conversations, commercial tracking, clinical pressures, their social media presence online, what they were seeing in terms of their go-to-market with patients, right? And before this happened, all before any deal discussion really started. By the time that Boston Scientific had moved, their internal familiarity with Axonics was already distributed across the CFO, the R&D, commercial, and legal team. That's why the deal could move a lot faster. For those of you who may not have seen it yet, it's actually coming out later in the month. I did an interview with the VP of Exploration or Corporate Venture at Edwards and the managing partner over at Sonder Capital. So corporate VC and your traditional VC, and both of them essentially said the same thing. And that's Deb Kilpatrick, by the way, over at Sonder, which is it takes time for these deals to proliferate, and then you have to make sure that your story and your company proliferate across the team in the organization, right? Which really helps a lot. There's a practical implication in all this, in that if you're 2 years from where you want to exit and you haven't started, let's say, actively mapping potential acquirers and their internal decision makers, you're already really behind. It's not fatally so either, but you're definitely behind. And when you map the 5 to 7 strategics where your technology would make sense, that helps a lot. So to find out who the actual decision makers are, you have to get into those rooms where those people show up, and you have to do that starting from now, not when, let's say, the data comes in. And I think more importantly, doing this also online, because you can go to different conferences, let's say 3 or 4 or 5 of them throughout the year where these people are at, but those are just moments in time. We need to think about what's happening the rest of the year. This is why at Marketcraft, we specifically take a lot of the narrative and the engineer of the market and translate into, on a weekly basis, how do we show up, and how do you make sure that the founder and the company are showing up on those strategic radars, on investors and even clinicians. And if you think about the way social media works today, it used to be a news cycle lasted, let's say, a week, but now because of social media, they've estimated a news cycle lasts about 2 to 2.5 days. And I'll ask you this, just to kind of prove a point about how content and attention works. Think about last week. Something happened last week that was the most important thing that happened last week, and it was a viral moment, right? What was that thing? You probably cannot remember. And so between, let's say, a conference you attend this week and let's say the next thing that you might go to, that might be a few months. How many 2.5 day news cycles per the internet are happening? Right? This is why staying relevant is so important, and staying in front of those people. It requires a weekly cadence, not just when you get like some press release once a quarter, if you're lucky even, and you show up, right? All right, let's move to lesson number 2. Lesson 2 is showing that you don't need to sell is actually your best negotiating. Okay. This is actually, it feels very counterintuitive to almost, I think, like every founder I've spoken to, but it's one of the most consistent patterns that I found across all of these interviews we've done on exits. So let's look at Mark McKenna, who is a phenomenal CEO from the biotech space. He took Prometheus Biosciences to a $10.8 billion exit to Merck. His framing of the exit process is probably one of the most clearest that I've ever heard on the show. He said, quote, "The best way to generate value for shareholders is to create a competitive process. That means more than 1 or 2 bidders. You need to signal the fact that you're not for sale, but you're open to a dialogue." As Mark McKenna from Prometheus Biosciences, that episode is episode 210 on the show. So he also flagged a stat that's worth sitting with. So 85% of biotech deals involve only one buyer. I'm going to repeat that again. 85% of all biotech deals involve only one buyer. One buyer, okay, and this is important. And think about the reason why you might be a medtech kind of thing, and like, Omar, what is it relevant to me? What happens in biotech? Biotech, that world is it just runs on M&A. M&A is an integral part to biotech tech, and the reason why is because it costs so much money to run these later stage trials and phases. A lot, sometimes in the billions of dollars. So you have to have M&A. Okay, so What does that mean? One buyer means no competitive tension. Okay. When there's no competitive tension, if you're a Medtech CEO and founder, I want you to listen to this. If you're experiencing VCs and investors essentially passing on you, strategics being polite but uninterested, and your breakthrough technology isn't really breaking through, you don't have a funding problem. What you have is a market problem. Let me explain. Here's the uncomfortable reality. Most medtech companies, and trust me, we know a lot about them because we interview hundreds of them on the show, they don't fail because the product doesn't work. They fail because the market never really forms around them. Clinical validation is not adoption. FDA clearance is not demand. And innovation alone does not create a category. What we've learned here, interviewing so many companies and also working with great companies at Marketcraft, is that the companies that win don't just build products. They engineer markets and they craft narratives. They define a category, they shape a belief, and they create the conditions where adoption becomes inevitable. And that's what we do here at Marketcraft. At Marketcraft, we've recruited a top quality team, not to really to run campaigns and not to do just marketing. What we do is we engineer and craft a market around you, and then we operationalize it. Because market engineering without execution is really just theory. So what we do is we act as an extension of your team, not as a vendor, but as a group responsible for turning your category into a reality. We deploy go-to-market campaigns aligned to your category narrative. We build investor awareness and shape how capital understands your space. We find ways to connect you with investors that we've built in our network. We enrich and activate the right data to surface real demand signals from the clinical market. And when the timing is right, we find ways to connect you directly with investors and strategic acquirers who are already tracking the category and figure out a way that we put you in front of them on a weekly basis through social media, through content and other areas. And so what's the result? The result of all this ends up being leverage. Leverage with clinicians so early adopters don't just evaluate you, they advocate for you. Leverage with investors so capital stops questioning you and starts chasing you for that deal to invest in your next round. And leverage with strategics so you're no longer just seen as a little startup in the industry. You're actually a category signal they can't ignore, and they want to get involved and invest in it and potentially acquire it. Because when you start owning momentum in a space, you're not just another startup. You become the company defining the future of that market. So if this resonates, I want you to go to marketcraft.ai. That's Marketcraft spelled with a C. .ai, and I want you to read what we do and then book a strategy call. When we show up to that strategy call, we're going to come with 2 to 3 ideas specific to you to understand where you are in the fundraising cycle, where you are in the market, and what you should do and start thinking about when it comes to defining your category and crafting a narrative and engineering the market around you. So to learn more, go to marketcraft.ai. At Marketcraft, we work with companies to craft their markets so that we help you go from launch to exit. And now let's get back to the episode. You're not negotiating. You're literally just accepting. You have no leverage. Okay. Dan Rose had a harder version of this lesson. He was initially hesitant to bring a strategic investor into LymphFlow's Series D, and his reasoning revealed the hidden cost of strategic capital. He said, quote, if a strategic invests and they don't buy you, other strategics see that and wonder, why are they not buying? You can lose leverage with other potential acquirers. And that's from his episode 164. Strategic investors on your cap table are not always the asset founders assume them to be. Okay. If the strategic relationship becomes complicated, it can quietly narrow your buyer field without anyone intending it to. I think this is going to change. I think, like, again, from my personal experience, what I've seen happen in the public markets and everything, when Boston Scientific invests in a deal and they're on the cap table, more often than not, like, Boston Scientific is going to buy that company, right? But Boston Scientific is rare in the sense that they have a pretty aggressive M&A strategy, and I think also a very thoughtful and disciplined venture strategy. And so not every strategy is like that. So these are things that are really important to keep in mind. Okay, the founders who generated essentially the highest exit values all had something in common, which was a credible alternative to selling. So let's go back to Prometheus with Mark McKenna. Prometheus could have run a phase 3 independently. Axonics, another example, was generating over $200 million in annual revenue before Boston Scientific even came in. LymphFlow had a clear path to IPO. as you build strategic relationships over time, the posture is always the same, which is we're building something important, we're open to the right conversation, and we'll be fine either way. I think that's very important. And again, this is why when we think about the traction gap and market engineering, if you don't know what those terms are, go back and look at my episode on market engineering, right? This is why when you start building the product out before you've done FDA trials or anything like that, you have to think about what's the minimum viable category you're creating. And the reason why that is that creates parity and it creates something novel, okay? Either you're going to be defining a new category or redefining one. In any case, you have to do it so that you're very different to not only get the attention and attract strategics and investors, but also your clinical market, right? Think about a buyer, what they're looking for. They're looking to buy something that is going to open up a new distribution channel to them, give them access to a customer base they normally haven't had before, right? And so you don't want to try, if it's one thing, I think, if you're entering this massive market and you're like a Me Too company and it's the market is so massive, like, hey, we can go after a good amount of that market and win it. That's one thing. In which case you're kind of redesigning a category. But most of the founders who are listening to this show, you are trying to position yourself as this very new and very different approach, right? And so you have to think about that minimal viable category, okay? If you're interested to learn more about that, just go to marketcraft.ai. We'll have different blogs and resources on that content. Okay, let's get to lesson 3. Lesson 3, hard endpoints beat surrogate measures every single time. What does that mean? Okay, so most medtech startups design their clinical trials to essentially satisfy an FDA, okay? And let's be honest, that's really what a lot of us do. The best ones, though, design with the full commercial and acquisition outcome in mind, okay? It's a very, very different approach, right? So let's go back to Dan Rose and LimFlow. LimFlow's clinical program is the clearest example that I've seen, covering this, okay? The condition that they were treating, which was chronic limb-threatening ischemia, the kind that essentially ends in amputation, had been studied mostly using surrogate endpoints like blood flow patency rate, okay? So Dan made a different call. And what he said was that LimFlow always used the hardest endpoints, not surrogate endpoints. We don't do patency studies. We do amputation and death studies because that's what the patient cares about, okay? And so the data that they ended up generating, 75% limb salvage at 6 months in patients who were otherwise heading toward amputation, was something that Inari's team could read without extrapolation, okay? There was no modeling, if the surrogate X maps out to outcome Y, it was just patients kept their limbs, okay? Acquirers don't want to essentially just buy clinical risk that they can't quantify, okay? A hard endpoint data eliminates that uncertainty. So it also simplifies the payer reimbursement conversation post-acquisition, which, going back to LimFlow, Inari knew they'd face immediately. Both of those things increase company value before a deal conversation even starts. If your current trial is built around surrogate measures, okay, it's worth asking whether you're optimizing for clearance alone or the full outcome you actually want, okay? Now, going on, lesson number 4. Lesson number 4 is your trial investigators are a strategic asset, not just scientific endorsements. Very important. And again, this goes back to, if you look at the traction gap, okay, framework. When you think about the traction gap, the very first thing when you're in your go-to-product phase, building it out, this is before you do your initial product release, your minimal viable product, all the things that have to do with FDA, right? This is why starting first with the minimum viable category is so important, because then it forces you into the discipline to really think about who are our investigators, right? And how do they become a strategic asset, okay? Versus just what most people do is like, let's look for a KOL for a scientific endorsement, okay? So most founders, what they end up doing is recruiting the world's, essentially recruit the world's leading believers in their approach, okay? The physicians that usually are most aligned, most experienced, most likely to become champions. Going back to Dan Rose, he went a completely different direction, okay? He wanted people who were essentially unconvinced, okay? He wanted leaders in vascular surgery community, surgeons who most often were more conservative in adopting new technologies than interventionalists. When that type of person gets up on podium and is willing to publish and back you up, that's gold. If it's a bunch of believers, the other group is just going to say, well, we don't trust that. And it's a good point, right? Because if you get people who are already biased, then they've already sort of sold their brand on that bias. Versus if you're able to get somebody who hasn't been a non-believer before and you convert them somehow, that is a lot more powerful and it's more persuasive. Think about the audience that you're trying to persuade, okay? And so when Dan did this, it was a gamble, but he won. When a conservative vascular surgeon becomes the one that's endorsing LymphFlow's outcomes, the rest of the surgical community really paid attention to that in a way that they wouldn't have for a data set like say, enthusiasts. The same mechanism applied to Inari's acquisition table. And the thing about for Inari, when you acquire something, you want, again, as I mentioned before, access to a new model of distribution, a new customer set, right? So your investigator list is not purely a scientific decision. It's a commercial and strategic one with long-term consequences for market adoption and essentially deal valuation. So try your best to choose skeptics. Let them be the ones who become proof. And just to touch on that, again, look in our catalog on Spotify. If you look up the term technology adoption, you'll see my episode on the technology adoption curve. While on one side, you do want to get early adopters or the early market. Of the early market, you have early adopters or visionaries. Before those people, you get what's called an innovator or tech enthusiast. You want people like that. But in some weird way, okay, and this is going to be hard. Again, this is why I believe figuring out that minimal viable category and having that narrative and that messaging going out sooner is easier because you're able to track these people and target them. Is somehow, if you look at the technology adoption curve, on the very far right, you have mainstream adopters and, of course, laggards, right? If somehow you're able to find somebody who's a skeptic or even a laggard when it comes to these things at the beginning, but in some way make them curious enough to trial the device and do some study and convert them into a tech enthusiast in this weird way, you've gone to the very far right of the adoption curve and taken somebody and converted them, not necessarily just into a tech enthusiast innovator. They're technically a visionary at that point, right? Because they're going to be a true believer because they were a skeptic. Think about that, the persuasiveness of that. If you take somebody who's a skeptic who has all this energy towards combating or refuting something, but somehow you're able to convert them, all that energy into working against you is now a tailwind working for you. So something to keep in mind. Easier said than done, but again, we want to cover like non-obvious lessons. Okay, lesson number 5, acquirer culture fit predicts post-acquisition outcomes better than deal size. This is very important because I can't mention who it is. I don't think it's, these are not people who have been on the show yet, but there have been founders who I talked to, who talked about how terrible post-acquisition was, because usually a lot of times post-acquisition, you have milestones, right? And so those milestones sometimes aren't met because the acquirer, just the culture did not fit and it didn't work. Okay. So across, over 350 conversations that we had on the show, the exits that went best for patients, employees, founders were often not the ones that went to the largest acquirer. Okay. If we go back to Inari Medical again, when they acquired LymphFlow with a market cap of roughly 3 to 4 billion at the time, it wasn't giant by Medtech standards. Okay. But the entire commercial team focus was on vascularization for at-risk patients. LymphFlow wasn't going to be one of 50 products in the rep's bag. Okay. Inari's culture was much more common with them. They had invested in market development for years in the space, and were not, and where essentially a lot of other people did not believe. Okay, let's look at good old Uncle Ray at Axonics. So Ray Cohen made the same calculation at Axonics. So before agreeing to terms with Boston Scientific, he studied their CEO Mike Mahoney's leadership style and the company's internal culture. And he said that Mike Mahoney is one of the greatest guys you'll ever meet. He's authentic as the day is long. The culture of the company, the way they go about doing their business, it was a fit. Okay, it matched Exonics, and they're really good people. Okay. And that's, you can go to Ray's episode. He's done a few of these with us. That's episode 245. Okay. Ray also made sure that most Exonics employees continued at Boston Scientific after the close. And this wasn't really a coincidence. He specifically evaluated potential buyers on that criterion before accepting terms. The reason this matters is that more than founders, this matters more than most founders acknowledge. Patient outcomes depend on commercial execution after the deal closes. Okay. And again, we have to think about it at the end of the day. What do? We always talk about it. What we do is for the patient on the table at the end of the day. Okay. If the acquirer's reps aren't incentivized to prioritize your product, if it's minor portfolio addition rather than a strategic opportunity, the adoption is going to stall. Okay. A smaller acquirer where your technology sits at the center of the strategy will drive better outcomes for patients and for, specifically, let's talk about the money, the earn-out structures, than a giant where it becomes like line 37 out of 80 things in the rep's bag. So choosing the acquirer will take the technology seriously after the papers are signed. Again, I think there are a lot, there's a lot of interesting and huge mega deals in our industry that happen. I won't mention them on this show for liability reasons, but go look at some of those and see why didn't they work out so well, right? And a lot of times it was the culture fit was not good. I know at the end of the day, as a founder and as a board, your goal is to maximize shareholder value, but we also have to think about the proliferation of the technology. And specifically, this is where, as a founder, I think you have to have a board that's got the vision and they're not just coin operated. I know that sounds almost counterintuitive, but hear me out on this for a second. Think of it like this, is that if you're a founder, this is your first medtech startup, okay, you don't want to leave money on the table, but you want to leave opportunity for the next thing. Because all of you, when you have your exits, I mean, look, Ray Cohen, had his first big exit over 2 decades ago. He wasn't done there, right? And so I think it's very, Dan Rose also, he's off to his second company, endovascular engineering. So I think it's also very important to pick the right acquirer, because when you go and raise, you have your next idea, you raise money, right? You want to be able to point to a great success, not just an exit, but a technology that's really proliferated and done well. And so being able to pick the right acquirers who's going to take your technology and make sure, think about all the effort you put into it and everything. You don't want your technology to die within the confines of the wrong acquirer's bag. Okay. Now, lesson 6, phase 2 data is the highest leverage exit window. Okay. And I think this is specifically, to biotech. But I wanted to pull this one out because a lot of you who are on the clinical side, you'll be able to extrapolate this as it applies to you. Okay. So yes, this lesson definitely applies directly to biotech and pharma adjacent companies. But here's the thing, the underlying principle extends broadly. The strongest exit timing is when clinical risk has just been materially, key point, materially de-risked, and the growth story is still fully priced in. So let's go back to Mark McKenna. Mark McKenna educated 17 potential acquirers on Prometheus throughout the company's development, all under a CDA, okay, before phase 2 results came in. Not 17 pitches, 17 ongoing education conversations. He built contacts, he built relationships, then he waited. He said, quote, "The data came out, we set a new high water mark for remission rates in inflammatory bowel disease. We quickly pivoted to our playbook. Operate as an independent company unless someone comes in with a serious offer." That was episode 210 of the show. And again, someone did at $10.8 billion. Okay. Before phase 2 data, acquirers are buying hypothesis. Okay. The risk is high and then they price it accordingly. After phase 3, the risk is lower and so is the upside. Right after strong phase 2 data is where founders have both the proof and the remaining upside working simultaneously in their favors. Founders who hold through phase 2 data with genuine conviction in their readout and move fast when the data supports it consistently capture significantly more value than those who exit early to take risk off the table. I think as it relates to medtech companies, you have to think about how do you privately start having, and this goes back to the first lesson, which is developing these relationships with these strategic acquirers, right? So on the one side, you want to be able to be very public on social media, doing thought, founder-led thought leadership, the company's publishing traction, everything. But then separately, you want to have very private conversations with multiple strategics whose acquisition of you makes sense. And one of the things that we try and do at Marketcraft is we'll develop an acquisition memo for a company for various strategics so that you're able to understand and say, hey, strategic number one, here's why an acquisition of our company in the future makes sense for you. This is where we fit in your portfolio, right? And so by doing that, now you're able to talk to them about data endpoints that are material, that are going to be important, that are de-risk the company before they actually come out, okay? And I think there's ways to do this, but again, I wanted to take a playbook from the biotech side just for you guys to understand that and see where that comes in, okay? And finally, lesson number 7, CEO temperament under adversity predicts exit outcomes more than technology quality. Okay, this is a very important one. And again, I know I've quoted a few specific episodes here, but going through all, 6 or 7 of the exit episodes that we've done, everything, plus the interviews I've done with founders privately, every exit that I've studied had a point where it almost did not happen. Okay. COVID delays, FDA hold, investor pressure to take an early deal. Okay. A competitive threat that changed the market calculus overnight, or even a funding round that came close not to closing. In every case, okay, what's interesting is that what got the company through wasn't the technology being strong enough. It was specifically how the CEO held the team and the board together and the clinical program together while all these external conditions shifted. Okay, so let's go to one of the episodes. Kinam Hong, who is a partner over at Sophie Nova, who co-invested in LymphFlow with Dan Rose, was direct about what separated the companies that made it from the ones that didn't. Okay, and he said, quote, "It's easy to say that the team did a good job when times are good, but it's how they face adversity that matters. Dan and his team had COVID. They had delays. They had a lot of things that could have gone wrong. It's a testament to him and his team that they righted the ship and got the study done, got groundbreaking results, got FDA approval, and ultimately got the exit." And that's from episode, again, 164. And Dan described what the exit table actually feels like from the inside. You're in between a lot of different people, the acquirers, the investors, whom may have very different motivations among themselves, your employees. There aren't a lot of friends and not a lot of places to go. If you go to good old Uncle Ray, Ray framed his version of this through Axonics commercial execution. Okay, 20 consecutive commercial quarters of beating analysts' expectations. Okay, not 19, not mostly, it was 20. Okay, and they beat their number every quarter. There's no other option. Okay, and one of my favorite quotes from Ray is, you got to go out and really light up the scoreboard. The repetition is deliberate. It's a philosophy. It's not an emphasis. The standard doesn't move because external circumstances make it convenient. That discipline, maintained over 15 years, quarter by quarter, is what built a company worth $3.7 billion. If you study the technology in medtech, that's important. You have to also study the CEO if you want to understand why the exit actually happened. I'll never forget that over 10 years ago, 15 years ago now, I met a really successful founder from tech, not medtech, just from tech, from the SaaS side, who had I think $4 billion of exits under his belt. And he told me that what he tries to do is think about the last days of the company. And the reason why he says that, the last days isn't leading to an exit, because what he found with one of the companies, when they started negotiations, the valuation was set to 250 million. And then by the time they finished the negotiations, the exit value was, and the valuation was set to 600 million. And so he was able to add more value in 6 months of negotiation than the company had been able to do in the previous 3 years, right? And so I think it's very important to understand those things and take those lessons into account, okay? So I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to leave me a comment, tell me what you thought about it. Watching this on Spotify or YouTube, go ahead and leave a comment below. Tell me what you thought about this, or X. We're big on X. For those of you who are not on X, you are, be sure to give us a follow at State of Medtech, and also I'm on there at Omar Khateeb. But I think it's important, again, the playbooks are there, right? And part of the reason why we have this show is to study, how do these people get these huge outsized returns? How do they leverage these exits for their companies? And the most important thing, I think, is as a CEO and founder, your mindset going into these things. And I'll share this. When I was in medical school, something that I was told was, when it came to making like ethical decisions as a physician, whether to keep somebody on like life support or do a surgery or anything, you have to have your ethics set up ahead of time so that you know what to do in that moment. You don't just think about it in that moment, right? I think this is very important also as a CEO and founder, which is right now, you're definitely in the position where you're, let's say, working on the product, you're doing clinical trial, all your energy there. You have to find ways throughout the day to daydream, to visualize, and almost role play in your head. What are you going to do in these situations when you're dealing with a board or an acquirer, etc.? And I think it's very valuable to visualize things that give you power, right? So like, go back and listen to some of these episodes on the exits, listen to what the CEOs are saying, and somehow recreate that scenario in your head and imagine yourself doing that for your own company. I think when you get into a good habit of doing these things, again, it's like playing pretend, it's role play. You not only visualize this for it to happen, but more importantly, you sort of set up these parameters ahead of time so you know what to do in those moments. Okay. So with that being said, I hope you enjoyed this. Give this video a thumbs up and subscribe, and we'll see you all next time.
Thanks for checking out this episode. If you want to do me a big favor and join so many other people who have helped grow this podcast, take a second and look below. If you're on Apple, give us 5 stars and write a short review. If you're on Spotify, just give us 5 stars. And if you're on YouTube, hit the like button. And most importantly, if you can, subscribe. We release so many different episodes that you may miss. Be sure to subscribe and turn your notifications on. You get extra points with me if you subscribe across all 3 channels. Thank you so much. And if you felt like this episode helped you, send this to somebody who would really enjoy and appreciate it. Share and spread the love. We'll see you all next time.